Teachers play an important role in developing a child's understanding of what it means to be a scientist. It is through the way they communicate with children that kids develop their perception of who can be a scientist, why they choose to do science, and what science can do for themselves and others. When we think of teaching, we often imagine a traditional strategy based on rote learning, with emphasis on rigorous homework assignments and ideal student behaviour. Some argue this does not allow children to question dominant narratives, and specifically does not do justice to science. Stephen Tompkins argues that working towards a set answer in the rigid frameworks of UK curriculums does not encompass the reality of being a scientist, or the fluidity of the world around us. Vigilant argues traditional schooling does not adequately encourage children to be curious or creative in scientific practices. The discourse on modes of science and education is engaged within both Frankenweenie and the Octonauts. In Frankenweenie, the most prominent teaching figure is Mr. Iskrowski, who replaces the old science teacher at the start of the movie. On the surface, he would appear to follow the authoritarian mode for teaching, with the low camera shots used to emphasise the child's perspective of the movie, making him dominate the frame in an intimidating manner, in conjunction with his unconventional teaching methods. He also appears to have an elitist mindset in regards to science and scientists, claiming that the adults of the town are too narrow-minded to understand the full weight of science, presenting the field as something exclusive for only a certain class of people.
I think the confusion here is that you are all very, is that the right word, ignorant? I mean stupid.
However, his approach to children and learning makes this discussion a little more nuanced. The reason he feels science is not for everyone in the town is because they are too wrapped up in conformity, opting to stay in the safe confines of what they know rather than question dominant narratives. The children, however, are not, as they are still learning and developing the knowledge of the world. Because of this, Mr. Iskrowski treats them with far more respect than he does the adults, such as when Victor approaches him to ask for advice on his experiments. Mr. Iskrowski insists that any child has the capability of being a scientist, so long as they have a good heart and the appropriate mindset of curiosity.
Actually, I have a question.
That is why you are scientist.
This model of teaching emphasizes not only doing science for compassionate reasons, but also encourages children to have agency and question dominant narratives, which for children is very inclusive.
The Octonauts doesn't have such direct representation of teachers, except maybe Professor Inkling, but due to it being an educational programme, the main cast act as teachers to the implied child viewer, for whom in The Lost Sea Star, Twinkle acts as surrogate. Her questions serve as prompts for the Octonauts to give mini lectures.
Oh, there's all kinds of fish up here.
That's because we're in the sunlight zone. The ocean is like a cake with 3 layers.
This is a good example of the value placed on curiosity and engagement by the Octonauts. Scientific information is framed within a context where it is wanted and interesting, not as something that must be learned for the child's own good. Captain Barnacles also does not deliver the facts as a formal lesson, instead approaching Twinkle to satisfy her curiosity. In its own way, this is a small rejection of mainstream teaching models based on hierarchy and obedience, and therefore an endorsement of an inclusive scientific environment in which participants will not be belittled or discounted based on age. On the other hand, the encouragement of experimentation seen in Frankenweenie is pretty absent in the Octonauts. Arguably, the crew themselves experiment a bit, like how they take Twinkle to the different ocean zones in search of her home, but the majority of the information is presented via appeals to authority. We verify Shellington's epiphany about algal blooms because the esteemed Professor Inkling was able to locate the correct book in his library. What clearer symbol could there be of traditional academic education? It's probably even peer-reviewed. And that's not to mention the relationship between the Octonauts and the viewer. The Octonauts is a thoroughly uninteractive text. You are not asked to make predictions or direct your own learning. You are asked to sit down and listen. The Octopod is haunted by the spectre of authority, from the almost paramilitary leadership of Captain Barnacles to the crew's power over life, death, and nature itself. As we've seen, both of these texts are somewhat of a mixed bag of inclusive and exclusive elements. While Frankenweenie includes direct and explicit support for children in science, as well as a focus on experimentation over rote learning, it promotes an elitist attitude about who can be a scientist. The Octonauts' emphasis on curiosity and enthusiasm does not propagate this elitism, though unfortunately its paternalistic approach to education reinforces a hierarchical model of science. Teachers hold a lot of power over children, probably second only to parents, and therefore play a huge part in shaping their perceptions of science. Ultimately, Frankenweenie is able to engage critically with this power structure, if in a somewhat limited way, while the Octonauts is more content with the status quo.